So what does the path to recovery for those affected by narcissistic abuse, especially from a parent? What does the path to
Mhm.
recovery look like for them?
Well, the first step is actually just in recognizing what actually narcissistic behavior is. What is a narcissist? It's been interesting in the last many years as this has become more part of the public conversation that more people are coming to me having already identified that compared to in times past where I was really having to break this down for them and show them what actually healthy parenting versus narcissistic parenting looks like. Because of course they didn't know any different. So that is the first step. And even with people who have some idea, there's still some nuances of understanding things that when they grew up in it, they didn't realize what it was doing to them and how it was impacting their sense of self and their sense of the world. And so starting to really unpack that and put things together, or realizing how choices that we've made were made for the either directly for a parent or because we didn't allow ourselves to explore other parts of who we were that weren't acceptable. And so there's this whole undoing of how these people learn to believe about themselves and the world from this old system versus bringing in a much broader set of possibilities for them. I think for some people, there's a lot of work around what does this mean if I accept my parent is a narcissist? What does this say about me? What does this say about the relationship? Do I still want this person in my life? If so, how? Sometimes there's a situation where a parent in the and these are probably people who are a little bit lower on the spectrum, not full NPD, through the difficulties they were going through as a young parent or whatever was going on in their lives, were really acting like a
Mm.
narcissistic family dynamic. But as the parent grew and as the child grew, there was actually healing that happened where the parent was able to show up differently, and they had an adult relationship that was much healthier.
Mm.
Sometimes there's this real reluctance to go back and look at a person's childhood because they don't want to rock the boat of this better relationship. And I think of this in terms not of going back to shame and judge and attack their parent, but to witness what their childhood experience was like.
Mm.
It's one thing to say, and as an adult, I understand that my parent did the best they could. And again, that is part of the healing. But if we aren't really looking at what that experience was like for that person as a child, there's an important piece of the understanding and of the work that gets missed.
Mm.
And so sometimes we have to go back, again, not focusing on what the parent did, but what the child experience was like
Yeah.
and how that is showing up still in the here and now. I mean, that's the thing. It isn't just that, somebody had a difficult childhood. It's that those things that were difficult are actually still showing up in different ways. And oftentimes the sign of that is when our reaction to something is disproportionate to the event. I had a client come in and was so upset because their boss had asked them to redo a report. And they were certain they were 5 minutes away from being fired. That's disproportionate to the event, they just and so that becomes this laser beam to seeing what trauma got triggered, like in that case, if they didn't come home with 100% on every single project, it was like, what did you do wrong? Or if they didn't excel at everything they did to the nth degree, there was hell to pay. And the parent was always finding something to criticize and reject them for and be
Mm.
angry at them. And so, that's kind of an example of why it's so important to do some of that deeper childhood work.
And from the childhood, especially if you have somebody who's really on the far end of the personality disorder as a parent, the
Hmm.
NPD, as someone is recovering from this or working with you to make the adjustment, I'd imagine that as a child, part of the teenage years are about creating your own identity. And it would seem to me that in those situations, those children didn't get to create their own identity, and now they're reaching out to you to try and do that. I mean, number one, how does it impact their relationship to their parents, and how do they relate to them now because they're trying to become their own person? And how does that transition work with them in working with you?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very common trait of people who are raised in narcissism, where they were not allowed to have that normal adolescent rebellion that is so much a part of forming our own identity that we have to disconnect from the identity. Even in healthy families, we have to disconnect from the identities of our parents in order to figure out who we are apart from them. And in a healthy family system, that is allowed to a great extent.
Mhm.
As painful as it is for the parent, it is, most parents will allow some degree of that, and that is really important. And in narcissistic families, that all is often not allowed, or the price to pay is terrible, being shut out and rejected and punished and shamed. And I have often worked with people who are in some ways having to do a later in life adolescent rebellion of sorts in a little bit more mindful way. Although I have seen people who come into therapy in midst of what is not a healthy rebellion for a 30 or 40 or 50-year-old to be doing, because they're finally trying to break free. And because it's kind of like acting out something from a time past, it's actually causing them harm in different ways. And so sometimes that work is, how do you rebel and release these expectations and these limits that were imposed on you in ways that are serving you and allowing you to experiment to become all of who you are
Hmm.
as defined by you?
And once that happens, once they start to get through some of the rebellion and creating their own identity separate from their parent, what's the relationship like with their parent? How do they view their parent? How do they continue to have a relationship with their parent?
Well, it is really various. Some people don't. Some of these relationships are so extremely toxic
Hmm.
that there just isn't a healthy path. Some of them I have seen where, when my client has established their own firm boundaries, that they know how how long, how often they can interact. And it's often where they're able to set a boundary of, when the parent starts going off onto one of their patterns, they're able to do something like, I am happy to continue this conversation if we can do it in a respectful way, or I'm happy to stay, but I'm not going to continue this conversation. If this conversation continues, if you continue to speak to me like this, I will need to leave. So, leave that call or that dinner. And so it's like they have this safety and trust in themselves that they can enjoy or have some connection to the parent in a way that's healthy, knowing that if it crosses a boundary, they will not allow themselves to continue to be subject to it.
Mhm. Hmm.
And sometimes that creates a positive feedback loop where the parent starts to accept the boundaries. And again, these are parents who have that ability to have some sense of self-reflection and taking some responsibility for their behavior. And, there's some really good relationships that have been formed with that.
I'm just curious, how do you discern between a parent who has narcissistic personality disorder versus they're on the spectrum, on the autistic spectrum somewhere?
Autistic?
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I want to be clear. I can't diagnose a
yeah,
person who isn't sitting in my office.
true, true.
I think of this in terms of clusters of traits, of the cluster of experiences my client has had with their parent or with their partner, and to help them figure out how to deal with it. So I'm not working with the narcissist. As I said, they have seldom come into therapy. I have worked with some of my clients have autistic partners who are on the spectrum,
Yeah.
but it hasn't tipped over into that really mean, hurtful behavior. And so there's some overlap of how do they show up with that person in a different way.
Mm. What are your final thoughts on someone who's experienced or think they've experienced narcissistic abuse, whether it was a parent or it was in a relationship, whether romantic or work or friendship, anything like that?
hmm Well, there's a lot of information out there. I am trained and certified through Dr. Carol McBride. Her website is Will I Ever Be Good Enough? It's an incredibly robust website with all sorts of information on there. So I think, starting with the identification and really getting to understand the patterns of the person you've been in this relationship with, how it has affected you, what it has either never allowed to grow in you or something that has been cut off in you, that you have the power to reclaim and to allow yourself to free yourself from these patterns that are not yours. They aren't about you. They have impacted you, but ultimately you have been on the receiving end of a way of being seen that is about the other person. And when you can reclaim and take back your own responsibility and trust of yourself for what you want and what you choose to do, and know that there is no longer anybody else controlling or limiting your decisions, it is such an empowering and freeing experience.